You may not realize it yet, but every time you spend another weekend pulling weeds out of your garden, you are probably creating an even bigger weed problem for yourself.
I made that same mistake for years. I thought hard work was the answer, so I kept digging, hoeing, and pulling every green shoot I could find. The result was always the same. A few days later, the weeds came back stronger, and I found myself doing the same tiring job all over again. If this sounds familiar, I want you to stay with me because what I am about to share completely changed the way I care for my vegetable garden. I stopped fighting weeds, and I started preventing them. The best part is that I did it without expensive products, without chemicals, and without spending hours bending over with an aching back. Many people throw away old newspapers and cardboard boxes without giving them a second thought. I used to do exactly the same thing until an older gardener showed me something that looked almost too simple to work. He smiled and told me that the cheapest things around the house often become the most valuable tools in the garden. At first, I was skeptical because laying cardboard on the soil sounded almost lazy. I believed weeds needed to be dug out by the roots, or they would always win. But after trying this forgotten method for one growing season, I never looked at those old boxes the same way again. The soil stayed moist much longer, the number of weeds dropped dramatically, and I spent more time harvesting vegetables instead of pulling unwanted plants. What surprised me even more was how healthy the soil became underneath that simple layer of cardboard. Earthworms appeared in places where I had barely seen them before, and the ground became softer every month. Most gardeners never discover this because they remove the cardboard too soon, or they use it the wrong way. There is one small detail that makes all the difference, and once you understand it, you will never want to fight weeds the old-fashioned way again. That little detail is where most people unknowingly ruin the entire method, and that is exactly what I want to show you next.
After I saw how much less time I was spending on weeds, I started paying closer attention to why this old method worked so well.
Most people believe weeds are simply stronger than vegetables, but that is not really the problem. The real problem is that every time you leave bare soil exposed to the sun, you are giving weed seeds exactly what they have been waiting for. They have been sitting quietly in the ground, sometimes for years, and the moment sunlight reaches them, they wake up. Then we wonder why they seem to appear overnight. I learned this lesson the hard way because I used to clean every inch of my garden until the soil looked neat and perfect. A week later, that same clean ground would be covered with fresh weeds again. I thought I needed to work harder, when in reality, I needed to disturb the soil much less. That was the mistake. The cardboard is not magic by itself. It works because it blocks the light that weed seeds need to grow while still allowing moisture to move slowly into the soil below. At the same time, the cardboard begins breaking down little by little and feeds the life already living underground. Many people do not realize that healthy soil is full of tiny living creatures working day and night. When you protect them, instead of exposing the soil to heat and drying winds, they reward you with softer ground that becomes easier to plant every season. One thing I was taught many years ago is never to place glossy, printed cardboard with heavy colored coatings in the vegetable garden. I always choose plain brown cardboard or simple black and white newspaper because it breaks down naturally and avoids unnecessary coatings. Before laying it down, I remove every piece of tape, every plastic label, and every staple. It only takes a few extra minutes, but it saves problems later. Then I overlap each piece by several inches because this is another place where most people make a mistake. If you leave small gaps between the sheets, weeds quickly find those openings and push through as if nothing was ever there. I learned that lesson after seeing one narrow strip of uncovered soil turn into a thick line of weeds while the rest of the bed stayed almost clean. There is another simple step that makes this method work even better, and surprisingly it costs almost nothing while making the entire garden look more natural.
Once the cardboard is in place, many people think the job is finished, but this is actually where the real secret begins.
Years ago, an older neighbor watched me lay cardboard across one of my garden beds, smiled, and asked me one simple question. "What are you going to put on top of it?" I looked at him because I honestly thought nothing else was needed. He shook his head and told me that cardboard should never be left sitting bare if I wanted the best results. That advice stayed with me, and after trying it myself, I understood exactly what he meant. I always cover the cardboard with a layer of natural mulch. Sometimes I use dry leaves. Sometimes I use grass clippings that have not been treated with chemicals. Other times I spread straw or partially finished compost. I simply use whatever I already have because the goal is not to spend money. The goal is to let nature do more of the work for me. This extra layer keeps the cardboard from drying out too quickly and prevents the wind from lifting the edges after a storm. It also gives the whole garden a cleaner and more natural appearance instead of looking like someone dumped old moving boxes across the yard. What surprised me most was how much longer the soil stayed damp underneath. During the hottest weeks of summer, I noticed I was watering much less often than before. While my neighbors were dragging hoses around every evening, I could push my hand under the mulch and still feel cool, moist soil. That alone made the method worthwhile because water is not getting any cheaper, and carrying watering cans becomes harder as we get older. There is another benefit that few people talk about. As the cardboard slowly softens, earthworms begin pulling tiny pieces down into the soil. Every time I lift a corner after several months, I find more worms than I used to see in an entire garden bed. Healthy worms mean healthier soil, and healthier soil grows stronger vegetables without demanding constant attention. Of course, this does not happen overnight. Patience is part of the process, and that is something many gardeners forget. They expect dramatic changes after 1 week and give up too early. I almost made that mistake myself until I noticed one surprising change near my tomato plants that convinced me this forgotten method was doing much more than simply stopping weeds. That discovery completely changed the way I prepare every new garden bed today.
The biggest surprise came when it was finally time to plant through the cardboard.
At first, I imagined it would be difficult, but it turned out to be much easier than I expected. I simply pulled the mulch aside where I wanted each plant to grow and used a small knife to cut a simple X in the cardboard. I folded the 4 corners back just enough to expose the soil underneath, dug my planting hole, and placed the seedling into the ground. That was all there was to it. The cardboard stayed everywhere else, quietly doing its job while my vegetables had all the room they needed to grow. I still use this same method every spring because it saves time from the very first day. One thing I learned many years ago is that you should always wet the cardboard thoroughly before covering it with mulch. Dry cardboard can curl around the edges or shift when the wind picks up, but once it is soaked with water, it settles tightly against the soil and stays exactly where you want it. It also begins breaking down much sooner, which helps the soil life underneath get to work. Most people skip this step because they are in a hurry, but those extra few minutes make a noticeable difference. As the weeks pass, I rarely see more than an occasional weed pushing through one of the planting holes. When I do, it comes out with almost no effort because the ground underneath remains loose and moist instead of becoming hard and compacted. That alone saves my back from hours of bending and pulling. Another small habit has helped me even more. Whenever I receive another cardboard box during the year, I flatten it and store it in a dry corner of my shed instead of throwing it away. By the time the next gardening season arrives, I already have enough material waiting for new beds or places where the old cardboard has completely disappeared into the soil. It costs me nothing, and I never have to rush out looking for expensive weed barriers. Little by little, this became part of my routine, and every season the work seemed easier than the year before. Then I noticed something else that I had not expected at all. The vegetables growing in those mulched beds looked healthier, needed less watering, and seemed to handle long periods of summer heat much better than the plants growing in bare soil. That unexpected difference made me start paying attention to another common mistake that quietly reduces many harvests without gardeners even realizing it.
As the seasons passed, I realized that cardboard was only part of the success.
The other part was learning what not to do. Most gardeners make one mistake that quietly ruins all the benefits of this method, and I nearly made it myself more than once. They become impatient. After seeing almost no weeds for a few weeks, they begin pulling the mulch aside, digging into the soil, and turning everything over again. The moment you disturb that protected ground, you bring thousands of buried weed seeds back to the surface where sunlight can reach them. Before long, the cycle starts all over again. I learned to trust the process instead. If I needed to plant something new, I made only a small opening exactly where it was needed and left the rest of the bed untouched. That simple habit saved me countless hours later in the season. Another thing that surprised me was how much healthier my soil smelled. It had that rich, earthy scent that every gardener enjoys because it tells you the ground is alive. Years ago, my soil often became dry, cracked, and hard after a few hot weeks without rain. Now, when I lift a little mulch and touch the soil underneath, it stays cool and loose much longer. Even after several sunny days, I can still feel moisture where the roots need it most. That means my vegetables suffer less stress during the hottest part of summer, and stressed plants rarely produce their best harvests. Few people talk about this because everyone focuses only on stopping weeds, but protecting the soil is just as important. I also stopped throwing away autumn leaves. Instead of seeing them as yard waste, I began collecting them for next year's mulch. Every season, nature provides another free layer of protection if we simply make use of it. The same goes for untreated grass clippings, small amounts of compost, or other natural materials that slowly feed the soil as they break down. There is no need for expensive landscape fabric that eventually tears apart and leaves plastic pieces everywhere. The old method is simpler and, in my experience, far more satisfying. Sometimes a weed will still appear through a planting hole or along the edge of a bed, but instead of fighting hundreds of weeds, I am pulling only a handful. That difference completely changes the way gardening feels. Instead of becoming another tiring chore, it becomes peaceful again. There is one final lesson this simple method taught me, and it has very little to do with weeds, but everything to do with enjoying the garden for many years to come.
Looking back now, I sometimes smile when I remember how much energy I wasted fighting my garden instead of working with it.
I believed a good gardener had to spend every free hour digging, weeding, and constantly fixing problems. The older I became, the more I realized that the smartest gardeners were often the ones doing less, not because they were lazy, but because they understood how nature already solves many problems if we stop getting in the way. Cardboard mulch taught me exactly that lesson. Today, my vegetable beds require far less effort than they did years ago, yet they usually look better than ever. I spend more time checking on my tomatoes, peppers, beans, and squash instead of carrying heavy tools from one end of the garden to the other. My watering cans stay full longer because the soil keeps its moisture. Even after a week of warm weather, I often find the ground underneath the mulch cool and comfortable for the roots. That gives me peace of mind whenever I leave home for a day or two because I know my plants are not drying out as quickly as they once did. One thing that has surprised many visitors is how quiet the work becomes. Instead of hearing the sound of a hoe scraping across dry soil every weekend, I simply walk through the garden, harvest what is ready, remove the occasional weed that slips through, and enjoy watching everything grow. Many people ask me what expensive weed barrier I use, and they are genuinely surprised when I point to ordinary cardboard that would have ended up in the recycling bin. That is one of my favorite parts of this method. It reminds me that some of the most useful gardening ideas cost almost nothing. They simply require a little patience and the willingness to try something that many people overlook. Of course, every garden is different, and you will probably make small adjustments depending on your climate and the materials you have available. That is perfectly normal. Gardening has never been about following strict rules. It is about observing, learning, and improving a little every season. Once you begin thinking that way, every year becomes easier than the last. And after seeing what this simple method has done for my own garden, There is one more forgotten habit that works beautifully alongside cardboard mulch and makes the soil even richer over time. That is a story I look forward to sharing with you very soon.
If there is one thing I hope you remember after watching this video, it is that a productive garden does not always belong to the person who works the hardest.
More often, it belongs to the person who learns to work a little smarter every season. I did not discover this method in a book or during an expensive gardening course. I learned it from people who believed that wasting nothing was simply part of everyday life. Old cardboard boxes and yesterday's newspapers were never considered rubbish if they could still serve one more purpose. That simple way of thinking has saved me countless hours, reduced my watering, and made gardening far more enjoyable than it used to be. I no longer feel like I am fighting weeds every weekend because most of them never get the chance to appear. Instead of spending my mornings pulling unwanted plants, I spend them picking tomatoes, beans, peppers, lettuce, and whatever else happens to be ready that day. My back feels better, my garden stays cleaner, and I find myself enjoying the quiet moments much more than I ever did before. That is probably the greatest reward of all. Gardening should bring satisfaction, not constant frustration. If you have never tried this forgotten method before, I encourage you to start with just one small bed. Save a few cardboard boxes, collect some natural mulch, and watch what happens over the next several months. Do not expect miracles in a single week, but pay attention to the little changes. Notice how the soil feels beneath the mulch. Notice how often you need to water. Count how many weeds you actually pull compared with previous years. Those small improvements add up surprisingly fast. Before long, you may find yourself covering every vegetable bed the same way, just as I did. Sometimes the oldest ideas stay alive because they continue to work generation after generation. I believe this is one of those ideas. Thank you for spending a little time with me today. I truly hope this simple method helps make your own garden easier to care for and more enjoyable throughout the growing season. And if you think this old-fashioned trick was useful, wait until you see another forgotten gardening habit that quietly builds rich soil year after year, using something that most people throw away without even realizing its value. I will share that with you in the next video.